Hello, Foxy listeners, and thanks for tuning in today. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about how 22% and stories relate together, what the four elements of a story are, and how you can use stories in your business. So let's have some fun. I'm Tanya Fox, and you're listening to Fox Talks Business Podcast. I started my career in the corporate world, but always played to my own tune and loved to think outside of the box. This didn't always serve me well with the bosses, so I made the decision to become an entrepreneur. And that little seed of entrepreneurial curiosity continued to grow as I branched out into retail, service, and franchise businesses. Now, I have been fortunate to have amazing successes in the last 2 decades, but they did not come without some really big failures and even bigger lessons learned. And that's why I started this podcast. Not just to share the failures, but to show you how you can turn every failure into a success. We're going to hear from some amazing humans from around the world that are going to share their stories of the good, the bad, and the motivational entrepreneurial life has to offer. After all, life is too short to make all of the mistakes yourself, so why not learn from each other? And of course, we're going to have some fun, because as I always say, well, you know what? I'll tell you that at the end of the episode. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Robert Kennedy III.
Yeah, let's go. Come on. All right.
Oh, so much better. You guys make sure that you head over to the YouTube channel to actually watch that video. That was awesome. That's a better way to enter, let me tell you.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Wouldn't that be fantastic if you, like, anytime somebody says your name, you had a band that just like busted through the door and was like, just kind of playing your music. You could dance into every room. That'd be fantastic.
I always thought it would be great to have a life that was just like a musical. Everywhere you went, people broke out into dance and
let's do it. Let's do it. We need to train the world differently.
Exactly. So tell us a little bit about your story, and then I want you to talk about why telling stories, especially your own personal story, is so important. But let's start with yours first.
Well, that is a huge question when you talk about my personal stories, because there are so many pieces of it, but I think the biggest piece has to do with how I ended up being a speaker who teaches others about speaking. And so that starts, really, the simple story is I was about 2 years old. I was born on the island Jamaica. And when in Jamaica, we have these people around us, teens, usually that are, we call them helpers, but they're kind of like nannies, maids, that type of thing. And I kept hearing, Bobby, you talk too much. You talk too much. You ask too many questions. You talk too much. And so as a kid, I shut up. I stopped speaking. I became that kid that would rather be in his room playing with trains than out at the birthday party, right? And so I was quiet for a very long time. And it was not until maybe my senior year of high school or my freshman year of college that I decided to kind of come out of my bubble, my shell. And there are a lot of different things that happened in that space. I was doing biology and history in school, but I became a radio news anchor for a little bit. And then I was a teacher for a while. And then I moved to developing my courses and then world of training and public speaking after that. So there's been this common thread of communication and speaking, even when I was told not to, since I was young. That's my story.
So, and I relate with that a lot, because that is very similar to my story, right? Like, you talk too much, you just, same thing. You ask too many questions. Like, she's just always, I mean, I used to talk to myself. I had great conversations. Didn't matter. Didn't even need to have anybody in the room. I could have a conversation.
Not important.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what made you decide to sort of step out of that and go, I don't want to be that quiet person anymore?
I don't remember the specific moment, but I do remember thinking that there were some kids in my class who were getting asked to do different things, become class president, represent the class or the school at some event, or they just seemed to get these opportunities. And I recognized, because I was a fairly smart kid, my grades were great, and I was always at the top of my class. But I realized that part of the reason that I was not getting certain opportunities was just that I was not speaking. And it was funny, even the negative attention sometimes I wasn't getting, right? Because I was this
Right.
good kid, never got in trouble. So I, just kind of sat there, right? And so one day I decided, you know what? What would it be like if I just kind of made jokes in class? And one day I said something in class, and I don't know if you've seen that Key and Peele episode where one of them says something funny in class, and the entire class busts out laughing, and he ends up going to speak with the president and performing on a comedy show after that. But it was kind of like that, right? I said something, and the entire class busted out laughing. I was like, oh my gosh. Oh. And I did it again. I did it a few more times. And the teacher kicked me out of the class. And I was so psyched. I was like, I got kicked out of class. Yes. And so I go to the principal's office and he's like, dude, what are you doing in here? And I said, the teacher kicked me out of class for making jokes. He said, cut it out. And he sent me back to class. I didn't, no suspension, no talking to. He was like, dude, I know who you are. Stop it. So that was kind of the journey. Again, I don't remember the exact day, but that's around the time that I said, hey, let me be a little bit bolder in the world.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about why people telling their story is important, especially in business. So take us
Mhm.
through a little bit of that.
Well, a lot of people have, well, not a lot of people, all people have challenges in their lives. And the thing about challenges is a lot of us feel like we are the only person experiencing those challenges. So one of the things that you want to do, and I just got off a session this morning with a company where we were talking about communication, and I said it's not simply about talking well. It's not simply about sharing information well. It's about creating connection. How do you create connection with people? And people connect with stories. For some reason, people like to know that there is somebody else who's just as jacked up as they are, right?
Yep.
Or they want to know, what's your origin story? How did you start this business? Why did you decide to start this business? What was the thing in your life? Just like you're asking me, dude, when did you decide to not be quiet anymore? Right? People want to know, okay, you have this shoe or this t-shirt business. Wow, why did you decide to start a yellow t-shirt business? What in your life made you passionate about yellow t-shirts? And you're like, oh, well, I got stung by a bee when I was 8 years old, and and I like the color yellow. So I don't know, whatever it is, but yeah, you that is just, it's a way to create connection with people.
Well, and do you find too, like, I find myself when someone explains something to me or tells me something in sort of a
Yeah,
story format, I remember it more
yeah.
because I remember the story more than just the facts.
Yeah. Well, I wish I was prepared for that line of questioning, because there's a presentation that I do, and I have a slide, and I've got about 20 words on the slide, and I say to the audience, "Hey, if you can I'll give you a gift. If you can remember all 20 of these words, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to memorize them in order, and then just repeat them to me." And every time I do it, I may get a maximum of 6 or 7. Some brilliant person does 6 or 7, or there's some smart aleck who always does like a screenshot and, and
Yeah.
tries to
And
start
then reads
reading
it.
it down. But yeah, right. But what I do after that is I take the words off screen, and then I bring them back and I say, here it is. Every morning I wake up, I come down the stairs, I come into my office, I turn on a switch, and I click a button, and my computer turns on. And then I do this thing, this activity. I create emails for 10 minutes, right? So all of the words that I had in order had to do with stairs, door, email, compose, plus sign. All of that stuff is inside of that story. And I say, does this help you remember the journey a bit more? Would you be able to remember these words in order if I show them to you again now that I've told you the story? They're like, yeah. And I say, yeah. People are 22 times more likely to remember a fact if it's wrapped in a story.
Mhm. I love that. And I think it's true because it almost as well makes you more relatable.
Mhm. Absolutely. 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 Because I mean, stories are like this. invitation to explore your brain. When somebody starts saying, especially if somebody starts a story and they ask a question or they say, imagine, or they say it was a long time ago, your mind literally takes as an invitation to start flipping through its mental Rolodex of scenes. And it's like, okay, what scene have I seen before? What scene have I experienced before? What scene can I imagine and conjure and create in my, imagination? And so once you're able to do that, especially as a speaker, that's a super advantage because now you take the attention off of you. People aren't looking for you to mess up. They're not necessarily listening to all of the data points that you have to share. What they are doing is creating a connection point in their brain, experiencing it there, playing their own mental video or creating their own mental image or animation. And when you create that connection, you're able to now take them on a journey with you instead of just simply paying attention to your words.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what stories to share because I'm sure there's people who are listening or going, but I don't like, yeah, I've got lots of stories because I've I've lived. But I
Yeah.
don't know which ones to share. That maybe they get stuck in that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are a lot of different reasons to share stories, and it really depends on what your reason is. If you're in a business and you want people to understand why you're in business, then it may be appropriate for you to share your origin story, why you started it in the first place, what you're passionate about, what brought you to the point of having a specific core value. Right. So an origin story is great there. If you are in a space where you are trying to get people behind a vision, get people behind an idea, then you might share a comparison story. What was it like without this idea? What was it like without this thing or this solution in the world? And then once people see, oh my gosh, yeah, that's not good, then you can share with them the story of this solution that you're offering. So there are a lot of different things. People think that you have to have a dramatic life or oh my gosh, everything wrong has happened to you. No, you can be born with two arms, two legs, two eyes, two noses, one nose. You can be born you can be born with kind of air quotes normal stuff and still have great stories to tell. Just what about a time that you failed a test or failed an exam? What about a time that you had to prepare for an exam? Everybody has done their driver's test at some point. Maybe you had to study for a certification at work. Maybe there was a time you had to learn a new skill. Your team, your job were upgrading the operating systems on the computers, and so you can no longer use Windows 95. Now you got to use Windows 10. Right. So all of those are common and shared experiences that people can connect with, and they don't have to be long. It can be literally 30 seconds. You can be 10 seconds. As long as you're able to share an experience and people are like, oh my gosh, I so get that. I understand what you're saying. I feel that. I experience that. I am that. All of those where you ultimately just want to make connection with people.
Well, and I think that's important for people to hear because a lot of times people go, well, I haven't had anything traumatic happen to me. Like I haven't
Yeah.
overcome something or,
Yeah.
something big. I haven't, like you said, I haven't lost a limb or anything like that. I've
Right.
just kind of led a normal
Yeah.
kind of ordinary life.
Yeah, sometimes it can be just a choice you're making. So, I'm wearing a blazer right now, right? So, several couple of weeks ago, I was going on a business trip, and I was like, "Man, I don't want to wear the blazers that are in my closet." I said, "Let me go to the mall." So, I go to the mall, and I go into the store, and I'm trying to think about what is it that I don't have, or what is it that I want, right? And so I go in and I see these blazers. Some of them have one button, some of them have three buttons, some of them have five buttons. I'm like, dude, that's too many buttons. I don't want to wear that many buttons. So well, I'm walking through, and all of a sudden, there's a blazer that kind of stands out to me. Right. And you know what happens when something stands out to you? It's kind of like the only thing is like, oh,
Yeah.
the heavens open. And so it stands out to me. And I'm like, oh my gosh, let me try that. And I go and I try it, and it's too small. They don't have it in my size, and I'm so super disappointed. And now I've got to go choose another and start that journey over. So that whole process of getting excited and then being let down because of an expectation that you had, and now feeling like you've got to choose
A
your
second
second
place.
best.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's a story.
Yeah.
People have experienced things like that.
Well, and I think this helps really people to sort of maybe open up, like on
Yeah.
some, like I'm even thinking too, like I remember just recently my son is getting ready to take his driver's test.
Mhm.
And so of course I'm helping him study. And as I'm helping him study, I realized I think I would fail if I had to take this test again. Right? Like, because there's some things I'm like, what? I don't remember that. Like I don't know what that sign means.
No,
Like, it's just
they only had one line on the road when I was growing up. You know, when you
I was
talk.
like, I'm like, I don't really, maybe we should get you into driver's ed because there's some
Yeah.
stuff on this test that I'm like, I don't know. Like, he's like, how far do you park away from the curb? And I'm like, I
As
don't
long as
know.
you don't hit it, you're good, right?
There's a measurement. I'm like, I've never really measured. I don't remember any of this. Right. But in my head, like, I remember sort of thinking like that story sort of took me to thinking like, what other stuff have I not done in a while that I would look
Wow.
back in business and go, would I still be able to do this? Like, would I
Yep.
still remember all of this stuff? Because I haven't used it for a long time.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. I mean, there are all sorts of stories like that, and I think it's really about us getting used to telling stories so that we can pull one from our vault when we need to. Right. So there's this great book by a guy named Matthew Dix. It's called Story Worthy, and inside of that book, he talks about a process that he goes through at the end of every day. He writes down just like all sorts of random events that happen during his day, and then he draws a line beside it and then says, okay, what was the lesson in that event? So if he had 5 experiences that day, has 5 lessons. And so the more that he does this and he can kind of pick out some of the different stories and lessons, then every time he needs one, it becomes a lot easier because he's used to noticing things, observing and cataloging them and deriving meaning from them. There's so many things that happen in our day, and because we're not paying attention and we're not looking for lessons and we're not looking for the stories in our day, we just kind of let them go by. And so then when it's time for a story, you're like, oh, I don't know. I don't have any stories. I'm just lumping a rock here,
Yeah.
bumping a log, whatever it is, right? So cataloging them and using them is a really good practice.
Well, and I think, there's so many times in someone's day that, something might happen to you that seems, just kind of normal, or you don't even think
Right.
anything of it. But when you write it down and try to pull a lesson from it, you might be
Yeah.
surprised about how many things that you go like, wow, that seemed like really insignificant in my life, but I could make that mean something.
Yeah. And there's so many different things. There's a story that I tell now that I didn't start telling until about 4 years ago. I was talking to my mastermind team and they were asking, I forgot how the conversation came up, but they were like, what's something amazing or odd that you've done in your life? Something simple. And I was like, oh, yeah, I learned to ride. I taught myself to ride a bicycle at the age of 8. They were like, "What do you mean you taught yourself?" I said, "I taught myself. I was at a friend's house, and my friend, it was just the two of us and his sister there. We were both 8, and his sister was 10. Parents left the house because that was back in the day when you could leave 8-year-olds home by themselves.
Yeah, like the street light is what told you you needed to come home. I love those
Right.
days.
Yeah. So I'm like, I want to ride my bike. I want to ride. I want to learn how to ride because I didn't have a bicycle at the time. And he was like, well, this is how you learn to ride. And he points out the window. And out the window, there's some kids riding their bicycles, but their parents behind them pushing them along, helping them to keep balance. And I'm like, dude, we have no parents here. I want to learn to ride today. He's like, okay, let's go outside. So he goes outside. We go to the garage. He hops on his bike. He takes off. I don't know how to ride. I grab his sister's bike with the ding ding, the bell and basket on the front, and and I get up onto the street and I'm trying to ride. I fall over because I don't know. I've never done this before. So I don't know how I figured it out, but his house was one of those houses that had the driveway that was on a decline that went underneath the house, and the garage underneath
Oh,
the
okay.
house.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, and so I figured out that I could just allow the bike to coast down the hill into the garage, and I would be okay. So I did that for 5 or 10 minutes. And after 5 or 10 minutes, I said, oh, okay, I can get my balance a little bit. And then I started putting my feet on the pedals and turning them a little bit, picking up a little bit of speed, getting into the garage, and then turning. I'm like, oh, okay, cool, this works. So after about 30 minutes, I get up on the street and I start to try to ride, and I'm kind of riding a little bit, but I'm still wobbly. At the end of the street, there's this hill. So I take the bike over to the end of the street and I perch at the top of the hill. And I'm like, okay, I can do this. And so I push the bike off and the bike starts to slowly pick up speed. I put my feet on the pedals. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. But then the hill starts to get a little bit steeper. And of course, that means the bicycle starts to go faster and it's starting to pick up speed now. And after a little while, the pedals are spinning so fast that my feet can't keep up. And so my feet fly off the pedals and I'm like, ah, right. So I'm riding down the bike is flying down this hill and it's getting steeper. And oh, by the way, at the bottom of the hill, there's an intersection. I'm coming closer and closer to this intersection. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, what do I need to do? I thought I had taught myself all the skills, but it just hit me that in the driveway, I forgot to teach myself an essential skill of bicycle riding, and that was brakes. Right? So I'm like freaking out at this point. Okay, what do I do? So just before the intersection, maybe about 100 yards, 50 yards, something like that, before the intersection, I noticed that there was a house with a lawn that was open. And so I took the bike and I threw it onto the lawn and I'm like flying through the lawn, grass, mud, and all sorts of stuff on my face. And the bike comes to a stop. I come to a stop in a totally different area. And after a few seconds, I kind of get up, push myself up, and I look around. And I look at the top of the hill, and my friend's at the top of the hill. He's like, oh my gosh, what did you do? But I'm like, dude, I made it. I rode my bike. And I'm like, yeah, like Adrian.
Success.
So, yes. Right. So I tell them that story and they're like cracking up and they're like, dude, why haven't you ever told us this story before? I said, it was just a bike story. I just rode. I learned how to ride my bicycle. They said, nah, that story is rich with so many different lessons. And we started to walk through the lessons, and the lessons, like, my gosh, sometimes somebody tells you that there's only one way to do things. My friend told me that's how you learn to ride. And no, you push through and you learned how to do it another way. Sometimes you're at the beginning of a process and it starts out really slow and you feel like you can handle it. But then after a little while, it picks up speed and your feet fly off the pedals and you're freaking out because you can't handle this thing anymore. And you feel totally like you're out of control. My gosh, sometimes you're in the middle of something and it feels out of control and you're just hoping that you'll make it through. But then something appears in front of you and it feels like you're going to have the biggest crash ever in your life and make it worse and you're never going to make it through this thing. How many of you have felt like that in your job, in your project, all of that? So we're workshopping these lessons, right? And then you get down to the bottom and you do that thing where you throw it onto the lawn and your bike crashes. And you could get up. You have the choice to get up and say, oh my God, this was the worst thing ever. I've got mud on my face. My knees are skinned. My bike scratched up. Or you could say, oh my gosh, this was the best thing ever.
Yeah.
That was awesome. I learned how to ride. Right. So at least 4 or 5 lessons. And I've told that story or portions of that story in so many different places. And I pull out so many different lessons or morals from it. And people just love hearing a simple story about how I learned to ride my bicycle when I was 8 years old.
I love that. I think it's, I think, in telling a story, like you said before, it brings up, I think if you surround yourself with people who are storytellers like yourself, it just automatically brings up stories yourself because like you said,
Yeah.
you almost sort of play through and go, oh, what does that remind me of? Or a moment in my life or something that I heard or whatever the
Yeah.
case may be.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And that's so right. I love that you're saying surrounding yourself with people who think or operate or communicate in a certain way is helpful to you. So maybe some people that are your listeners, you may even want to get together, do a story practice session because there may be stuff that comes up for you that you hadn't thought of before.
yeah. Or even sharing those stories that someone else can help you, like you were talking about, that you just shared a story to you at that time, it was just a story of
Yeah.
you riding a bike, but they helped you to realize, oh, but this is what I got out of that story. Like, this is
Right.
how, I realized, something more, something deeper
Yeah.
in that.
Hmm.
So when people are getting ready and they're like, okay, I want to start sharing stories, what's the easiest way to go about it? Is it just getting on that bike and trying to go down that hill?
Well, that's really the easiest way to do it. Just start sharing stories. However, people also have to recognize that stories have a structure, right? You can have several different ways. I mean, Kurt Vonnegut, who's one of the kings of storytelling, talks about the hero's journey. There's spark lines, there's the mountain story. There's a lot of different story types, but all stories have four essential elements, and those are setting, character, conflict, and resolution, right? Or I say context, character, conflict, and conclusion, right? So those are the four main elements of a story. And so if you can pick those elements out of even in business stories, and as I teach corporate professionals about how to create stories from what's happening in your workplace, right? People are like, dude, I mean, I'm a numbers cruncher. I'm an accountant. How do I have stories there? Yeah, well, you got to figure out what the context is first, right? What's happening in people's space? Who does it affect? Who are the characters? How are they experiencing it? What is the real problem? What is the challenge that has developed inside of all of this? And then ultimately, what is the solution? Especially if you've got a business and you've got a product that you sell or a service that you sell, figuring out how to position that service as the answer to a conflict or a problem that your prospect, suspect, client, or customer has, right? Then you become a storyteller. And so storytelling isn't always about the once upon a time. It's a lot of times about utilizing and recognizing the framework so that you can share information in a way that connects with people and moves them to action.
I love that you said that, because if there's anybody who's listening right now who is an accountant or does any type of financial reporting,
Yeah.
especially at like general meetings, it's the one thing coming from a financial background that I was like, good Lord, don't just say the numbers. Like, just make something up. Like, could you bring a
Yep.
balloon? Could you bring like a blowhorn? Could you just something like confetti in your pocket? Because it's the most boring portion to have to sit through. Those people
Yep.
need stories.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not hard. I mean, they don't have to think about, pink unicorns, purple hearts, green horseshoes. They don't have to think about all of that stuff. It's really about getting people to think, imagine, create a video in their brains. And some of that simply is last year at this time, we were experiencing a downturn in our economy. As a matter of fact, because of the downturn, here's how we were operating. We were doing this. We were at about 72% of our capacity. Then this year, we got some new resources in and we were able to operate at 90% of capacity. But we recognized that with these new resources, we didn't have the appropriate training for it to take place. And that was a big gap. We had 90% capacity. Our customers had a certain expectation. And so therefore, we still were leaving about $3 million per month on the table. How do we fix that? Well, here's what we did.
Yeah.
I just told you a story
Yeah.
with the numbers.
Yeah. But it helps, I think, too, like, it just helps people, like you were talking about in the word story, it helps people to almost retain that information, because it's easier to remember a story than to remember facts.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you've been to a typical presentation with like financial planners or the treasurer portion of meetings, like you, I'm just like, oh my god, bang on the desk, right? Right? So, if you've been to one of those with the PowerPoint with the 49 colors on the pie chart, and you're kind of like eyes glazed over, trying to figure out what to focus on, right? Can these people create a story so that, yeah, we can talk graphics, we can talk about how not to overwhelm people, how not to do death by PowerPoint, but if you can tell a story around it simply so that you can help people understand how to make the connection between what they're seeing on screen and the words that are coming out of your mouth, then that's a win. That's a better place for people to be, instead of having them try to interpret and figure it all out and be overwhelmed and then totally start grabbing their phones and get inside of that.
Yeah. I think the best one that I ever heard was the accountant walked up to the mic and went, "We didn't lose any money. We were doing better, but here's the best successes." And then he started listing, he was like, "We got the boss into a dunk tank. Sherry didn't have her lunch stolen for the last 5 months." Like, it was like, but
Yeah.
everybody was like killing themselves laughing. And really, at the end of the day, nobody who was sitting around the table really cared. They were just like, "Are we broke? Are we good to go? Do we all have our jobs? Great. Thank you."
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Yeah.
Yes. What's for lunch?
Yeah. Next person. So
Exactly.
let's talk a little bit about where people can connect with you, or even where people can get help, because I'm sure there's still some people who are out there who are going like, how do I still do this? Maybe have more questions.
Yeah. So the easiest way to do that is go to getintouchwithrk3.com. That's my landing page. All the things, all of my web connections, all of my socials. There's some resources there about storytelling, about speaking. You can grab that stuff, and it's easy to get in touch with me there. My email, or at least my email icon, is there, and people can get in touch with me that way.
So I want to talk a little bit, because I was telling you beforehand that I was kind of cyber stalking you before the interview and learning all of the things
Uh-oh.
about you. And I really liked your Monday morning get up.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about like what made you think of starting doing that, and then because I'm going to link to some of them, because some of them were very, very powerful, but I want to know the story
Fantastic.
behind those.
Well, you know what? It's not one specific story. I think over time, what's happened with me is, if I determine how I want to show up or who I need to be in a specific space or a specific time, I can try to do it myself, or I can pull people on the journey with me. And so, if I'm going to speak motivation, if I'm like, dude, it's Monday morning, you need to get your butt on fire and start moving, then I share that with people. If there's quotes, if there's motivation, if there's affirmation that I need to read in order to get myself moving, then I share that with people. And so the Monday morning get up is a way for me to intentionally focus on positive, intentionally focus on inspiration, and not just read a quote, but now attach a story to it, attach maybe several stories to it, because it then also gets me in the continued practice of storytelling. So it's not just I'm doing this show, it's literally speaking practice for me. And so those are the reasons why I do that. I'm talking to myself more often than not.
And sometimes, like I said in the beginning, those are the best conversations you can ever have.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Robert, it has been an absolute pleasure. I think there is so much in this episode. And what I like the most about it is that it is the message that it doesn't matter what has happened in your life. Everybody
Mm.
has a story that needs to be heard and needs to be told.
I love it. Listen, you said it in that way. At the end of every podcast episode, I used to have a podcast called What's My Story. And at the end of every episode, I would talk about how a lot of the times the experiences in your life may feel like they're challenges. And I say, everything that happens to you in life is your stuff. Your stuff is your story, and your story deserves a stage. So get on out there and tell it.
So I want to challenge everybody that tuned in to this episode to go out and share a story. It can be business, it can be personal. I just want you to start getting used to sharing, as Robert said in this episode. So this could be you just telling the story through your voice. This could be telling it through writing, whatever feels genuine to you. And make sure you tag me when you do it, because I want to hear all the amazing stories that you guys have. It's one of the reasons I do this podcast, is to be able to share people's stories, you know, where they came from, what they're doing, and why they do it. So I want to hear yours as well. So don't forget those tags. Also, don't forget to check the show notes where you can find Monday Morning Get Up. I've really been enjoying listening to these, and I think you guys will too. So I'm going to give you the link to my favorite one, and I want to hear what you think. What did you take away from it? So whether you're hearing a story, telling a story, or reading a story, I hope you take time today to have fun. Because as I always say, if you're not having fun, why are you doing it?